What happens when America's most beloved late-night host decides to corner a member of the British royal family with questions they never saw coming? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most explosive television moments that had viewers around the world dropping their jaws. Prince Harry thought he was walking into a friendly chat about his charitable work, but Steve Colbert had other plans, and what unfolded was nothing short of television warfare. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me what you think really motivates talk show hosts to go after their guests like this. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had been riding high in the ratings for months, and booking Prince Harry seemed like the perfect way to cap off a stellar season. The Duke of Sussex had been making rounds promoting his latest charitable initiative, and his team reached out to several major networks for interview opportunities. Colbert's producers jumped at the chance, promising a light-hearted conversation focused on Harry's humanitarian efforts and his life in California with Meghan and their children. What Prince Harry didn't know was that Colbert had been spending weeks preparing for this interview with a completely different agenda. Behind the scenes, the comedian had been growing increasingly frustrated with what he saw as the privileged complaints of wealthy celebrities, and he'd decided that Harry represented everything wrong with modern celebrity culture. Colbert's research team had compiled a thick folder of controversial quotes, family disputes, and financial details that painted Harry in the worst possible light. The green room before the show felt tense from the moment Harry arrived. Usually, guests and hosts spend a few minutes chatting casually before filming, building rapport that translates to easy on-screen chemistry. But when Colbert popped his head into Harry's dressing room, his greeting was notably cold and professional. Harry, ever the diplomat, tried to break the ice with some humor about American coffee versus British tea, but Colbert barely cracked a smile before excusing himself to prepare for the show. Harry's team noticed the shift immediately. His publicist, a seasoned professional who'd worked with A-list celebrities for decades, pulled Harry aside to mention that something felt off about the host's demeanor. But Harry, confident in his media training and genuine passion for his charitable work, brushed off the concerns. He'd faced hostile British tabloids for years. How bad could an American comedy show really be? The show's opening went normally enough, with Colbert delivering his usual monologue to warm up the studio audience. But those paying close attention might have noticed that his jokes seemed sharper than usual, with several pointed references to privilege and entitlement that would later seem like obvious foreshadowing. The audience laughed along, unaware that they were about to witness television history. When Harry walked out to thunderous applause, he appeared relaxed and genuinely happy to be there. He waved to the crowd, shook Colbert's hand warmly, and settled into the guest chair with the easy confidence of someone who'd done hundreds of interviews. The first few minutes proceeded exactly as expected, with Colbert asking softball questions about Harry's recent trip to Nigeria and his work with veteran organizations. But even during these seemingly innocent exchanges, viewers who knew what to look for could see Colbert laying groundwork for what was coming. His follow-up questions carried subtle barbs, and his facial expressions during Harry's answers suggested skepticism rather than genuine interest. Harry, focused on explaining his charitable initiatives with genuine enthusiasm, missed these early warning signs completely. The turning point came when Colbert shifted from discussing Harry's current projects to asking about his motivations for leaving royal duties. What started as a reasonable question about personal growth quickly morphed into something much more aggressive. Colbert's tone changed completely as he leaned forward in his chair, his famous smile replaced by a look of barely contained disdain. "Let me ask you something that I think a lot of Americans are wondering," Colbert said, his voice dropping to a more serious register that immediately put Harry on alert. "You've spent years now complaining about the pressures of royal life, the media attention, the lack of privacy. But here you are, constantly in the spotlight, Writing books, doing interviews, making documentaries. It seems like you want it both ways, doesn't it? The question hung in the air, like a challenge, and Harry's expression shifted from friendly openness to cautious defensiveness. This wasn't the conversation his team had been promised, and it certainly wasn't the direction he'd expected from someone he'd assumed would be sympathetic to his story. The studio audience, sensing the change in atmosphere, grew noticeably quieter. Harry took a moment to collect his thoughts before responding, his media training kicking in as he tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. I think there's a difference between choosing when and how to share your story versus having every aspect of your private life dissected without your consent, he said carefully. The work we're doing now allows us to control our own narrative, while highlighting causes that matter to us. But Colbert wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic answer. Instead of moving on to the next topic as most hosts would, he doubled down, his questions becoming increasingly personal and pointed. "Control your narrative," he repeated with obvious sarcasm dripping from his voice. "Is that what you call it when you and your wife sit down with Oprah and make explosive claims about your family that they can't publicly respond to? That seems less like controlling your narrative and more like controlling theirs." The accusation hit Harry like a physical blow. And for the first time in the interview, his composure cracked slightly. His jaw tightened, and his hands, which had been gesturing naturally throughout their conversation, clenched into fists on the armrests of his chair. The audience could feel the tension building, though many still assumed this was just spirited debate rather than the beginning of a complete breakdown in civility. "I think you're mischaracterizing what happened in that interview," Harry said, his voice carrying the first hint of real anger. "We spoke our truth about experiences that were genuinely harmful to our mental health and our family's safety. If that made some people uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine why hearing about racism and institutional failures bothers them more than the racism and institutional failures themselves." Colbert's response was swift and brutal, delivered with the timing of a seasoned comedian, but the cruelty of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "Your truth," he said, emphasizing the words mockingly. "That's convenient phrasing, isn't it? Because truth is usually just truth, not something that belongs to any particular person. But I guess when you're used to having your own version of reality catered to your preferences, the idea of objective facts must seem pretty foreign." The insult was so blatant and so unexpected that it left Harry speechless for several seconds. The studio audience, finally understanding that this had moved far beyond normal interview boundaries, began to murmur uncomfortably. Some people laughed nervously, unsure how to react to seeing a guest treated so aggressively on what was supposed to be an entertainment program. Harry's training had prepared him for hostile questions from journalists, but nothing had prepared him for this level of personal attack, disguised as comedy on what should have been friendly territory. His face flushed red, and when he finally found his voice, the diplomatic mask had begun to slip completely. "I came here tonight expecting to have a conversation about the important work we're doing to support veterans and promote mental health awareness," Harry said, his words coming faster now as his frustration mounted. "Instead, you seem more interested in cheap shots and personal attacks. Is this really what your audience tunes in for?" Colbert's response to Harry's challenge was everything his fans loved about him, and everything his critics feared. He leaned back in his chair with theatrical confidence, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace the confrontation he'd been orchestrating from the beginning. The smile that spread across his face wasn't warm or welcoming. It was the predatory grin of someone who'd finally cornered their prey exactly where they wanted them. "Oh, this is absolutely what my audience tunes in for," Colbert said, his voice rising with mock enthusiasm. "They tune in to see people held accountable for their actions instead of being handed softball questions that let them play victim while sitting in million-dollar mansions. You want to talk about your charitable work? Let's talk about how much of your charity money actually reaches the people you claim to help versus how much goes to administrative costs and executive salaries. The accusation was a direct attack on Harry's integrity, suggesting financial impropriety in his charitable endeavors, without any evidence to support such claims. Harry's face went from flushed to pale as the implications sank in. His charitable work wasn't just a PR strategy or a way to stay relevant. It was genuinely the thing he cared most about in his post-royal life. Watching Colbert twist it into something corrupt and self-serving was more painful than any personal insult could have been. "That's completely false, and you know it," Harry said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Our financial records are public and transparent. Every penny is accounted for, and the vast majority goes directly to program funding. How dare you sit there and make baseless accusations about work that's helping real people with real problems?" But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, Harry's emotional response seemed to energize him further. He turned to face the audience directly, playing to them like a comedian working a hostile crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing something incredible here tonight. We're seeing what happens when someone who's used to having their every word treated as gospel finally meets someone who's willing to ask the hard questions." The audience's reaction was mixed and uncomfortable. Some people clapped, caught up in Colbert's showmanship, and convinced that this was all part of some elaborate bit they weren't quite understanding. Others sat in stunned silence, recognizing that they were watching someone's reputation being destroyed in real time for the sake of entertainment. The energy in the room felt electric but wrong, like watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. Harry looked around the studio with growing disbelief, finally understanding that this wasn't just an aggressive interview, it was a coordinated ambush designed to humiliate him in front of millions of viewers. The realization that he'd walked into a trap, that his team had been lied to about the nature of this appearance, made his anger burn even hotter. "You invited me here under false pretenses," Harry said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the audience. "Your producers promised a discussion about charitable work and mental health advocacy. Instead, you've turned this into some kind of character assassination, masquerading as comedy. This isn't journalism, it's cruelty dressed up as entertainment." Colbert's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath the polished television persona. "False pretenses?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I think you're confused about what this show is. This isn't the BBC where everyone has to pretend your opinions matter because of who your grandmother was. This is America, where we judge people by their actions, not their bloodline." The attack on Harry's heritage and his late grandmother was a bridge too far, even for viewers who might have been enjoying the conflict up to that point. The Queen had been universally respected, even by Americans who generally had little patience for monarchy, and bringing her into what was supposed to be a discussion about current events felt gratuitously cruel. Harry's entire demeanor changed in that moment. The diplomatic training, the media coaching, the years of biting his tongue in the face of provocation, all of it evaporated in the face of an insult to his grandmother's memory. He sat forward, in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles went white. "Leave my grandmother out of this," Harry said, his voice low and dangerous. "She spent 70 years serving the people of Britain and the Commonwealth with dignity and grace. She never used her platform to tear people down for cheap laughs, and she certainly never ambushed guests who came to her in good faith." But Colbert, perhaps sensing that he'd found the one thing that could truly break Harry's composure, decided to push even harder. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings by mentioning your grandmother? Maybe you should call your therapist and schedule an emergency session to talk about how mean the American comedian was to you." The mockery of Harry's well-documented struggles with mental health was the final straw. The audience gasped audibly as Harry shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a moment, the studio fell completely silent except for the hum of the cameras that were capturing every second of the breakdown. "You're disgusting," Harry said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned quiet. "You sit there making jokes about mental health while people are literally dying from suicide and depression. You mock charity work that's actually saving lives. You insult a woman who devoted her entire existence to public service. And you do it all while hiding behind the excuse that it's just comedy." Colbert, perhaps realizing that he'd pushed things too far but unable to back down without losing face in front of his audience, tried to regain control of the situation with more humor. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've triggered our guest. Should we get him a safe space? Maybe some tea and crumpets to help him feel better?" The audience's reaction was notably more subdued this time. Many people weren't laughing anymore, recognizing that they were witnessing genuine cruelty rather than clever comedy. But some viewers were still caught up in the spectacle, cheering Colbert's attacks as if this were some kind of sporting event rather than a human being having a very public breakdown. Harry looked around the studio one more time, taking in the cameras, the audience, the host, who was still smirking at him from behind the desk. The realization that millions of people would see this, that his children might someday watch their father being humiliated on television, made something inside him snap completely. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to use whatever platform I have to help people," Harry said, his voice rising with each word. "I've worked with veterans suffering from PTSD. I've supported AIDS orphans in Africa. I've campaigned for mental health awareness. I've tried to make the world a little bit better in whatever small way I can. And you've turned that into a punchline." He paused, looking directly into the main camera, as if speaking to viewers at home, rather than the studio. "Audience, this is what passes for entertainment now? Tearing down people who are trying to do good in the world? Making jokes about mental health? And mocking charitable work? If this is what America finds funny, then I honestly don't understand what's happened to this country." The accusation that America itself had somehow failed morally was too much for Colbert to ignore. He stood up behind his desk, abandoning any pretense of this being a normal interview. "Don't you dare lecture us about what's wrong with America," he shot back. "You don't get to come here, live in our country, benefit from our freedoms, and then tell us we're not good enough for your royal standards." "I never said I was better than anyone," Harry replied, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "I said I was trying to help people, and you've turned that into something shameful. You've made caring about others into a target for ridicule." Colbert's final response was delivered with all the venom he'd been building up throughout the interview. "You know what's shameful? Abandoning your family, your country, and your responsibilities. Then spending years complaining about how hard your privileged life was while people are struggling to pay rent and put food on the table. That's what's shameful." Harry stood there for a long moment, staring at Colbert with a mixture of rage and disgust that was painful to watch. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable for everyone in the room. Then, without another word, he reached up and unclipped his microphone, letting it fall to the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the studio's sound system. The sound of the microphone hitting the floor seemed to wake everyone in the studio from the trance they'd fallen into while watching the confrontation unfold. Suddenly, the reality of what they were witnessing hit home. This wasn't scripted television drama or carefully orchestrated controversy designed to generate social media buzz. This was a complete breakdown of professional courtesy, a moment where entertainment had crossed the line into genuine human cruelty. Colbert, perhaps, finally recognizing that he'd pushed things beyond any reasonable boundary, tried to salvage the situation with damage control. "Hey, come on now," he said, his tone shifting from aggressive to almost pleading. "Let's not end things like this. Sit back down. We can finish this conversation like adults." But Harry was done being reasonable. The diplomatic facade that had served him through years of royal duties and public appearances had been completely shattered by Colbert's relentless attacks. He turned to face the host one final time, and the look in his eyes was something that would haunt everyone who saw it. It wasn't anger anymore, it was disappointment so profound it was almost heartbreaking to witness. "Adults," Harry said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the studio's microphones. "Adults don't ambush their guests. Adults don't mock mental health struggles. Adults don't make cruel jokes about dead grandmothers. Adults don't turn charity work into ammunition for personal attacks. What you've done here tonight isn't adult behavior. It's the worst kind of childish bullying, and you've done it in front of millions of people who deserved better from you." The studio audience, which had been murmuring and shifting uncomfortably throughout the confrontation, fell completely silent. Many people were looking down at their hands or staring at the floor, as if they couldn't bear to make eye contact with either man on stage. The energy in the room had shifted from electric tension to something much more somber and ashamed. Colbert tried one more time to regain control, falling back on the defense that had served him throughout his career. "Look, this is comedy, okay? This is what we do here. We ask tough questions, we push boundaries, we make people think. If you can't handle that, then maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." Harry's response was swift and devastating. Comedy is supposed to bring joy to people's lives, not destroy them. Comedy is supposed to punch up at the powerful, not tear down people who are trying to help others. What you've done tonight isn't comedy, it's cruelty. And the fact that you're hiding behind humor to justify it makes it even worse. He paused, looking out at the audience before continuing. "I came here tonight to talk about veterans who are struggling with mental health, about children in Africa who need medical care, about the importance of breaking down the stigma around asking for help when you're struggling. Instead, you've turned all of those important issues into punchlines. You've made helping people seem like something to be ashamed of." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, and for the first time since the interview began, Colbert seemed genuinely at a loss for words. His usual quick wit and sharp comebacks had deserted him, leaving him standing behind his desk looking smaller and more defensive than anyone had ever seen him. Harry wasn't finished. The words that came next were delivered with the kind of quiet authority that reminded everyone in the room that, despite everything that had happened, they were still in the presence of someone who had been raised to lead and to serve. "You know what the saddest part of all this is? You have an incredible platform. You reach millions of people every night. You could use that influence to highlight important causes, to bring attention to people who are suffering, to make the world a little bit better. Instead, you've used it to tear people down for sport." He gestured toward the audience, many of whom were now visibly uncomfortable with their role as witnesses to the destruction they'd just watched. "These people came here tonight expecting to laugh, to feel good, to forget about their problems for a little while. Instead, you've shown them the worst of human nature. You've taught them that cruelty is entertaining, that kindness is weakness, that caring about others makes you a target." The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the television cameras seemed deafeningly loud. Production assistants, who had been moving around the edges of the set, had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. Even the usually busy control room had gone quiet, with producers and directors transfixed by what they were seeing through their monitors. Colbert made one final attempt to salvage his reputation and his show. "You're being overly dramatic," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is television. People understand that. They know this is all just entertainment. Harry's final response was delivered with a sadness that was more damaging than any angry outburst could have been. Is it entertainment when someone goes home tonight and feels a little bit worse about trying to help others because they saw you mock charity? Work? Is it entertainment when someone struggling with depression decides not to seek help because they saw you make fun of mental health advocacy? Is it entertainment when a veteran watches this and feels ashamed for needing support? He shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd experienced. You've used your platform to make the world a colder, crueler place, and you've done it while people applauded. That's not entertainment, that's a tragedy. Without waiting for a response, Harry turned and began walking toward the exit. But before he reached the edge of the stage, he stopped and turned back one more time. The camera caught him in profile, and viewers could see the exhaustion and disappointment etched across his face. I genuinely hope that someday you understand the damage you've done tonight, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but still carrying clearly through the studio. Not just to me, but to everyone who believed that kindness and service mattered. You've made caring about others seem foolish, and that's something that will hurt people long after the cameras stop rolling. With that, he walked off the stage, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. The camera stayed on Colbert, who was left standing behind his desk looking like a man who had won a battle, but lost something much more important in the process. The audience sat in complete silence, unsure how to react to what they'd just witnessed. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a few people began to stand up and walk out, as if they couldn't bear to remain in the same room where they'd watched someone be torn down so completely. Others followed, until a steady stream of audience members was heading for the exits, leaving behind empty seats and a host who was finally beginning to understand the cost of his cruelty. The cameras kept rolling for another minute, capturing Colbert's futile attempts to transition to a commercial break, his voice cracking as he tried to make jokes that no one was laughing at anymore. The magic that had made him one of America's most beloved late-night hosts had been broken, replaced by something ugly and small that no amount of clever writing could fix. What started as entertainment had become something else entirely. A moment that would be remembered not for its humor, but for its humanity. Or rather, for the complete absence of it. The audience that remained sat in uncomfortable silence, wondering how laughter had turned into something so painful to witness. The show would eventually go to commercial. The remaining segments would be quietly cancelled, and everyone would go home trying to forget what they'd seen. But the damage was done. Not just to the relationships between the people involved, but to the very idea that tearing others down could ever be considered entertainment worth celebrating. So what do you think? When entertainers have platforms this powerful, do they have a responsibility to use them for good rather than for personal attacks? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal what really happens when the cameras are rolling and the masks come off.